It was a Saturday morning in late October, the kind where sunlight feels thinner, and leaves drift like forgotten thoughts across the sidewalk. Samuel Whitaker had just poured himself a cup of black coffee when the doorbell rang. Softly, just once. No knock, no footsteps, just the hush of wind brushing through the old maple outside. He opened the door and looked around. No delivery truck, no neighborhood kid playing a prank. Just a small, neatly wrapped package resting on the welcome mat, tied with twine and marked with his name. No return address, no company logo. Just Samuel Whitaker, written in quiet, careful handwriting. Curious and mildly unsettled. He brought the box inside and placed it on the kitchen table. He hesitated a moment, then untied the string and peeled away the brown paper. Inside was an hourglass. It lay nestled in a bed of black velvet. The wood frame was smooth and dark, shaped as if carved by time itself. The glass was flawless, rounded like a drop of water. Inside flowed the most peculiar sand, fine as dust, glowing faintly like starlight suspended mid-fall. It was already flowing, grain by grain, with a rhythm both mesmerizing and irreversible. Samuel leaned closer, as if to hear the sand speak. Beneath the hourglass sat a single card. Your hourglass account has been activated. Remaining time, 4,230 hours. Deposits, not accepted. Reversals, not permitted. Flow rate, 1 grain per second. He flipped the card over. There was only one line written on the back, in a gentle slant. Time does not wait, but it does whisper. Samuel, 52 years old. A widower. He had spent the last 7 years in a house that had grown too quiet. The rooms were filled with her memory. Photographs that hadn't moved in years, bookshelves still holding her handwriting in the margins. His days were predictable. Coffee, editing manuscripts, watching the neighborhood change without him. Evenings came quietly, nights quieter still. This hourglass didn't belong in such a life. And yet, as he held it in both hands, something inside him stirred. Not panic, not confusion, but presence. A strange sense that time, which he had treated like a shadow, always there, never noticed, was suddenly sitting across from him, watching. He placed the hourglass on the windowsill where morning light could reach it. And he watched, for the first time in years, as time visibly passed him by. At first, Samuel tried to forget about it. The hourglass remained on the windowsill, still and silent, like a decoration rescued from an antique shop. He still brewed his coffee each morning, edited manuscripts as usual, walked out to the backyard, and settled into the old wooden chair beside the lavender bush. Life continued in its familiar rhythm. One quiet day folded into the next. But something subtle had shifted. He had started to hear time. Not with his ears, but with something deeper. The sand inside the glass made no sound, and yet Samuel could feel each second as it passed. When the morning light spilled across the curved glass, the falling grains caught the glow like golden droplets. Beautiful but indifferent. He found himself watching it while waiting for the kettle to boil, while his emails loaded, while the toaster slowly browned his bread. And the strangest part was, every time he looked, he felt something inside him fall too. A gentle weight, soft ache, as if he'd been missing something all along. Not an appointment, not a responsibility, but life itself. That afternoon, he left his desk earlier than usual. No real reason. He just felt like walking, not to get exercise but to look, to listen. Passing through the small park near his home, he stopped at an oak tree he had never noticed before. Its leaves had turned a brilliant orange-red and were falling one by one, slowly like quiet farewells before winter arrived. He sat on a stone bench, hands deep in his coat pockets, and tilted his head toward the sky. In that moment there was no phone, no email, no background TV, only wind, the scent of damp earth, and a kind of silence that felt more honest than anything he'd heard in years. The next morning, long before his alarm stirred, Samuel opened his eyes to a house still draped in quiet. There was no particular sound that woke him, just an unusual stillness, the kind that arrives not as a disturbance, but as an invitation. He sat at the edge of the bed for a moment, then walked to the kitchen in his slippers, set the kettle to boil, and turned to the window as sunlight began to seep through the curtains. The hourglass stood exactly where he had left it, but this morning it looked different. Not because it had changed, but because he had. The sand was still falling, as steady and silent as before, but now he saw it not as something abstract or decorative. He saw it as something deeply personal, something alive. It hadn't stopped overnight. Course not. It would never stop. But somehow, without realizing it, Samuel had. Something in him had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. He didn't reach for his laptop. He didn't open his inbox. Instead, he walked across the room and picked up the old cordless phone sitting unused on the side table. The plastic felt almost foreign in his hands. He scrolled through the names in the contact list, each one a small memory of a person, a conversation once postponed. His thumb paused at a name he hadn't seen in a while. Margaret Whitaker, his sister. They hadn't spoken in nearly 7 months. Not because of any argument or falling out, just the quiet drift of adult life. The kind where messages go unread, and days pass faster than intentions. He hesitated only for a moment before pressing call. Her voice on the other end was startled, then warm, and then, somewhere between laughter and silence, Samuel heard something else, vulnerability. That small tremble in her tone, as if his call had unlocked something they'd both been carrying in silence. They spoke for over an hour, weaving in and out of childhood memories. The way their mother used to hum when folding towels, the little scar on Samuel's knee from falling off the bike they once shared, the sound of their father's voice calling them in at dusk. It wasn't a dramatic conversation, but it felt like one of the most honest he'd had in years. When he hung up, there was no regret, no guilt, only a surprising sense of wholeness. Like something that had been quietly broken had been gently mended. Later that day, Samuel walked 2 blocks down to the yellow house on the corner, the one belonging to Mrs. Harwood, his elderly neighbor who lived alone. She often waved from her porch, always with a kind smile, but he'd never stopped to speak more than a sentence or two. This time, he brought her a paper bag with 2 blueberry muffins and stood awkwardly on her porch until she invited him in. They sat by the window with mugs of tea and shared stories that didn't need to be impressive, just real. She told him about the time she danced on a table in Florence, and he laughed, not out of politeness, but from some forgotten place inside himself, a part that had been waiting to be remembered. That evening, as the light softened and the world returned to its hush, Samuel sat beside the hourglass once more. He didn't just watch the sand fall. He spoke to it, not out loud to fill silence, but as someone who had begun to understand it. With a quiet smile and eyes still holding the day, he whispered, "Today mattered. I think I spent a grain well." The hourglass, of course, gave no reply. But in the silence, something within him nodded, not in words but in a knowing. A soft, sacred knowing that maybe, just maybe, time had noticed him too. The days that followed moved with a different rhythm. They still contained coffee and quiet, and light spilling through curtains in the morning. But there was something new running underneath it all, something invisible but present, like an old melody he had once loved, now softly playing again in the background of his days. Samuel found himself pausing more often, not from fatigue but from awareness. He stopped to watch a squirrel build its nest in the tree behind his house. He waited for the bread to finish baking instead of walking away. He let silence stretch longer in conversations, and realized it didn't need to be filled. The hourglass remained on the windowsill, its sand still falling, but now it felt less like a reminder of what was running out, and more like a companion quietly asking, "And what will you do with this next grain?" One overcast Thursday, as wind teased the shutters and the sky hung low, Samuel felt a pull he hadn't felt in years. He climbed the attic stairs, slowly, carefully, his fingers trailing the wooden banister. His breath caught somewhere between curiosity and nostalgia. The attic had not changed. Still dusty, still lined with old trunks and boxes, still holding the kind of silence that felt ancient. He opened the cedar chest near the small circular window, the one his wife used to call the eye of the house. The hinges creaked, as if exhaling years. Inside, buried beneath folded quilts and yellowing papers, was a journal. His journal. He sat cross-legged on the wooden floor and opened it. The handwriting was his, but younger, looser, braver maybe. There were sketches of songs, half-finished poems, notes from hikes he and his wife had taken. Jokes. Scribbled thoughts that had no purpose but still meant something. As he turned the pages, he met a version of himself he hadn't seen in a long time. Not the man who survived each day, but the one who once lived them with curiosity. Then he found a list, written in block letters at the top of a page titled, "Things I Want to Do While I Still Feel Young." Learn to play her favorite song on piano. Take a train with no destination. Watch the stars from a mountain peak. Start a small poetry club. Tell the people I love that I love them. He stared at it for a long time. And not with regret, but with reverence. Because for the first time in years, this list didn't feel like something he had abandoned. Felt like something still waiting, still possible. He closed the journal gently, like one might close a prayer, and held it to his chest. Outside, the wind shifted slightly, and through the attic window, he could see the hourglass in the corner of the living room below. Still glowing, still falling. He smiled. "I thought I had more time," he whispered, not as a complaint, but as a confession. Truth. And in the silence that followed, the falling sand seemed to agree. Not with words, but with presence. As if to say, "You still do." That weekend, as the late afternoon sun warmed the wooden floor of his kitchen, Samuel pinned the old journal page, the one with the list, next to the clock. Not to measure the passing hours, but to remind himself what those hours were meant for. It wasn't a checklist. It wasn't a race against time. It was a gentle invitation from the man he used to be to the man he still had time to become. He stood in front of the upright piano in the living room, brushing off a thin film of dust with the sleeve of his cardigan. The piano hadn't been played in years, not since she passed. Its silence had become part of the house. But today, silence felt like something ready to be transformed. He opened the lid and sat down slowly. The first few notes were hesitant, clumsy. His fingers stumbled, his memory reaching backward through fog. But he didn't try to be perfect. He tried to be present. Each note he found was like finding a piece of her again. The melody wasn't complete, but it was honest. And sometimes that's more than enough. He didn't stop there. On a cloudy Tuesday morning, he boarded a train with no return ticket in hand. Just a backpack, a notebook, and a quiet sense of wonder. He watched unfamiliar landscapes roll past the window. Wheat fields, small towns with names he didn't recognize, rivers that shimmered like stories waiting to be told. He spoke with a woman knitting socks for her grandchildren. Shared sandwiches with a young man heading to his first job. And somewhere along that winding track, Samuel realized he wasn't escaping his life. He was re-entering it. When he returned home, he posted a handwritten sign on the bulletin board at the community center just a few blocks from his house. It read, "Quiet Words Club. Bring a book, a poem, or just your voice. We'll meet. We'll share. We'll be slow on purpose." At the first gathering, only 4 people came. By the third, there were 11. Teenager brought cookies. An older man recited haikus. A shy woman, who hadn't spoken in public for years, read a letter to her younger self that made everyone cry. They didn't come to impress each other. They came to remember what words were for. Samuel watched them from his seat by the window, hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea, and realized this small circle of strangers had become something sacred. Not a club, not a project, but a home for time well spent. He still glanced at the hourglass from time to time. It was lower now. The sand had thinned into a graceful ribbon. But it no longer frightened him. Because now each grain that fell had weight, had warmth, had meaning. And that made all the difference. Winter arrived not with thunder or ice, but with gentleness. Snow fell in hushes, mornings turned slower, and the world, like Samuel, seemed to soften. By now, the hourglass on the windowsill had changed. Its top chamber held only a narrow column of shimmering grains, descending one by one with delicate purpose. There were fewer than before, visibly so, but Samuel didn't count them anymore. He cherished them. Each morning he lit a candle on the kitchen table, not out of habit, but as a quiet ritual to mark the start of another sacred day. And each night before sleep found him, he sat at his writing desk and composed letters, never to be sent, only to be left behind. He wrote to his sister, thanking her for laughter and forgiveness. He wrote to his wife, remembering how she used to dance barefoot in the hallway when she thought no one was watching. He wrote to the man he used to be, not with judgment but with grace, telling him it was okay he had forgotten for a while, that forgetting is part of remembering too. And he wrote to his niece's unborn daughter, a girl he would never meet, telling her that life was fragile but beautiful and that her voice would matter. Each letter he folded carefully, slid into an envelope, and placed in a small wooden box by the window, a gift for a time he would never see. On one particular afternoon, when the sky was the color of ash and the wind brushed gently against the eaves, Samuel took one final train ride. No destination in mind, just motion, just memory. He sat by the window in a quiet carriage, a thermos of tea in his hand and his old journal tucked in his coat. Towns passed like old friends waving goodbye. He scribbled a poem on the back of a napkin and smiled as he wrote. The grains fall not to empty us, but to shape what's left behind. We are not what time takes. We are what time reveals. When he returned home that evening, he placed the poem in the same velvet-lined box the hourglass had once come in. Then he sealed it with quiet care. In the weeks that followed, Samuel gave away what he no longer needed, not because he was letting go, but because he was making space. He donated his books to the town library, tucking handwritten notes into the margins. Not critiques, just questions, reflections, whispers to future readers. He gave his piano to a local teenager who dreamed of studying music. He passed his stories to a schoolteacher who promised to read them aloud on rainy afternoons. He gave his time, what remained of it, not to control or collect but to complete. And one evening, as snow gently traced the windows with lace-like frost, Samuel wrapped himself in his favorite cardigan, brewed a final cup of tea, and sat beside the hourglass. Only a few grains remained. He watched them fall, not with sadness, not with fear, but with a heart full of something deeper than either, gratitude. And as the final grain touched the base with the softest unseen landing, the hourglass glowed one last time, briefly, warmly, like the hush of a candle just before it goes out. Samuel closed his eyes and exhaled into peace. They found him in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise. The house was still, as it had always been. A cup of tea rested untouched on the side table, still faintly warm. The candle had burned itself out, and Samuel sat in his favorite chair by the window, head slightly tilted, lips gently parted as if he had just finished a thought he didn't need to say aloud. There was no pain in the room, no sorrow, only stillness, and the unmistakable feeling that something had been completed. On the windowsill, the hourglass stood quietly, its top chamber now empty. The sand below glowed faintly in the morning light, like embers remembering a fire. Beside it, neatly folded, was a letter, written in Samuel's calm, steady hand, addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." They opened it with care, as one might open something sacred. And inside, in ink that hadn't yet faded, were these words. "If you're reading this, then perhaps your time is whispering too. I was once someone who didn't notice the days slipping by. I filled calendars, not moments. I chased noise, mistaking it for purpose. Then came the hourglass, not as a warning, but as a gift. Didn't extend my time, deepened it. It taught me that time doesn't shout. It hums softly beneath the surface. It doesn't demand, it invites. So if you still have grains left, don't count them. Feel them. Call someone. Sit in the sun without needing a reason. Laugh even if you're alone. Write something no one else will ever read. Forgive. Begin again. Let your life be full, not of noise but of presence, not of urgency but of meaning. Because when the final grain falls, it won't be the hours you logged or the things you owned that matter. It will be the love you gave, the kindness you showed, the quiet peace you allowed yourself to feel. And if no one told you yet today, you still have time. Use it as if it were the rarest treasure you'll ever hold. 'Cause it is. They read it in silence, then folded the notes slowly, carefully, like closing the final page of a story that somehow had always belonged to them too. And from that day on, the hourglass was never seen as a relic. It became a reminder, a quiet voice in the room, not shouting, just whispering. Now is your moment. Live it.